The horse wasn't supposed to run that way, especially not with him on its back. The stallion suddenly broke formation, tearing across the arena as the crowd's laughter snapped into silence mid-breath. No commands, no struggle, just a straight, relentless charge toward a sealed gate no one had opened in years. And the man they mocked? He wasn't trying to stop it, he was letting it take him somewhere. It clearly remembered. By the time the horse was brought into the ring, the lanterns around the estate had already begun to glow against the evening cold, casting long ribbons of gold over polished rails and pressed black coats. It was the kind of light meant to flatter wealth. It softened the sharp edges of the grandstand, warmed the silver buttons on the stable hands' jackets, and made the Millionaire's private arena look less like a training ground and more like a stage. Everyone there understood the performance. Men with heavy watches stood near the front with glasses in hand. Women wrapped in velvet and fur leaned close to one another, speaking in low voices that carried little flashes of amusement. The horse would be shown, praised, admired. The owner would accept their envy as if it were tribute. Someone would mention bloodlines, discipline, cost. The right people would smile. Then the gate at the far end opened again. At first, few noticed the man who stepped through. He did not belong to the glow of that place. His coat was plain and dark with age, his hat creased by weather instead of fashion. He moved with the kind of caution that came from real work, not self-consciousness. Nothing about him asked to be seen. And yet, once a few faces turned, the change spread quickly, like wind moving across dry grass. A murmur passed through the crowd, then a laugh, then another. The man kept walking. On the far side of the arena, standing beneath a carved wooden arch and a row of hanging lights, Vernon Hale rested one gloved hand on the rail. He wore his prosperity the way other men wore armor. Nothing in his posture suggested surprise, but something in his eyes sharpened the moment he recognized the man in the dust below. "Well," Hale said, his voice carrying easily over the arena, "this is unexpected." A few people smiled before they even knew why. The stranger stopped near the center rail, not close enough to challenge, not far enough to retreat. He lifted his gaze, not to the audience, but to the horse. The stallion stood with a dark saddle draped across its back, head slightly elevated, ears shifting at every sound. He was a tall bay with a black mane thick as spilled ink, his chest broad, his legs clean and powerful under the lantern glow. There was no wild thrashing in him, no obvious temper for spectacle. What made him arresting was not violence, it was restraint. The horse held himself like something that had learned to endure too many hands. The man's expression changed when he saw him. Not wonder, not fear, recognition. Someone near the front let out a low chuckle. "You've got nerve, I'll give you that." Another voice, louder now, "Or no memory." This time the laughter came more freely because the old story had already begun to wake among them. People did not need facts, they only needed fragments. A ruined season, a death no one liked to speak of plainly. A stable boy turned away, a name spoken less and less over the years until it had become easier to attach blame than detail. The man put one hand on the rail. "I want to ride him," he said. The sentence was simple, but it landed strangely in the decorated air, stripped of apology or performance. A few people laughed harder, grateful for how ridiculous it sounded. One woman covered her mouth, smiling into her glove. A ranch broker in a gray hat shook his head before turning to his friend. Hale did not smile right away. Instead, he studied the man below him with a look that seemed almost tired. "You should have stayed gone." The stranger did not answer. A young groom led the horse a half-step forward. The stallion tossed his head once, then steadied. The crowd's attention shifted back toward him, expecting the animal to reject the interruption on their behalf. But instead of pinning his ears or stamping in protest, the horse went still. Not calm, listening. The man took one slow step toward the rail. Lantern light caught the side of his face, showing a jaw gone leaner with time, a scar near one temple, eyes that carried the flat stillness of someone long accustomed to being watched for the wrong reasons. "I'm not here for your approval," he said quietly. That drew a few sharper laughs. Approval was exactly what everyone believed he had once wanted and failed to keep. Hale finally gave them a smile, thin and polished. And yet here you are, in my arena, reaching again for what was never yours." A hush followed that line, not out of respect, but anticipation. The estate had become very quiet in the way places do when cruelty is about to dress itself as wit. The man's hand tightened once on the rail, then relaxed. "I didn't come back for the arena." His voice was low, but the horse heard it. The stallion's ears flicked forward. That small movement did not look like much, yet it altered the air more effectively than any raised voice could have. A few heads turned. Hale saw it too. For the first time, his confidence shifted by the smallest degree. The man stepped closer, slow enough not to threaten, direct enough not to beg. The groom hesitated and looked up for instruction. Hale gave none. All the warmth drained out of the evening. Somewhere beyond the arena, a chain tapped softly against a post in the wind. A lantern hissed. Leather creaked. The man reached toward the hanging bridle near the gate, and before his fingers even touched it, the horse drew in a deep breath and lifted his head as though some old, half-buried memory had just stirred awake. No one told him to mount. That, more than anything, unsettled the crowd. In every demonstration that had ever taken place in that arena, there had always been a signal, a nod from Hale, a gesture from a handler, a shared understanding that what followed was permitted. But now, as the man reached for the bridle and slipped it free with quiet, practiced hands, there was no such permission. Only silence. The groom stepped back instinctively, as if something invisible had shifted between man and animal, something he had not been trained to manage. "You really think it'll let you?" someone called out, the mockery thinner now, stretched by unease. The man didn't answer. He didn't look at them at all. He moved closer to the stallion, one step at a time, not circling, not testing, just approaching in a straight, unbroken line, the kind of approach that only worked if it came without doubt. The horse watched him, not with agitation, not with defiance, with attention. The man stopped at the horse's shoulder. For a moment he said nothing. His hand hovered just above the animal's neck, close enough to feel the heat rising through the coat, but not touching. It was the smallest pause. And yet it carried the weight of something unfinished, something neither of them had named out loud. Then his hand settled. The stallion exhaled. A long, steady breath that seemed to ripple through his body, loosening something tight beneath the surface. A murmur passed through the crowd, not loud, not coordinated, just the sound of expectation beginning to fracture. Hale shifted his stance against the rail. "Enough of this," he said, not raising his voice. "If you've come to embarrass yourself, don't drag my horse into it." Still, he did not give the order to stop. The man slid his fingers along the horse's neck, then down toward the saddle. He checked the strap out of habit more than necessity. The leather was new, well kept, untouched by long work. Everything about the animal had been maintained to be seen, not lived with. "You've kept him clean," the man said quietly, almost to himself. The stallion's ears twitched at the sound. Something in the tone did not belong to the present moment. A few people in the stands leaned forward now, no longer laughing. There was a tension building, not sharp but strange, like a story unfolding in a language they didn't quite understand. Without warning, the man placed his foot in the stirrup and pulled himself up. The motion was clean, controlled, without hesitation. No flourish, no rush, just weight transferring from ground to saddle in a single decisive movement. Gasps scattered across the arena. The horse tensed beneath him. For a heartbeat, it looked as though the entire scene would snap back into something familiar, the animal rearing, the rider thrown, the crowd reclaiming its laughter like a right. A few men even shifted their stance, ready for the impact. But the stallion didn't explode. He didn't move at all. His muscles tightened, then held, his head lifted slightly, ears flicking back and forth as if searching for a command that never came. The man did not pull the reins. He did not press with his legs. He simply sat there, balanced, quiet, waiting. "Go on, then," someone shouted, forcing a grin. "Show us how long you last." A ripple of laughter followed, but it didn't catch the way it had before. It faltered, broke apart, and died too quickly. The man leaned forward just a fraction, his voice low enough that only the horse could hear it. "Easy," he murmured. The word carried no urgency, no demand. It sounded less like instruction and more like recognition, as if it belonged to a conversation that had started long ago and never quite ended. The stallion's tail flicked once, then, slowly, he took a step. Not toward the center ring, not along the polished path meant for display. He stepped sideways, the wrong direction. A few heads turned, confused. The groom frowned. Hale straightened. The horse took another step, this time more certain. His body angled away from the lantern-lit center, away from the grandstand, toward the darker edge of the arena, where the fence curved toward the old grounds. "Turn him!" Hale called, sharper now. The man did nothing. He didn't correct the movement, didn't resist it. If anything, he leaned with it. The stallion's pace quickened. 2 steps, 3. Then a sudden, decisive shift, zawag, the kind that comes not from hesitation, but from decision. The horse broke into a run. A collective gasp tore through the stands as the stallion surged forward, hooves striking hard against the packed ground, sending a scatter of dust and frost into the air. But he wasn't circling. He wasn't performing. He was leaving. "Stop him!" Hale barked. The command rang out, but it reached no one who could obey it. The horse drove straight toward the far boundary, where a secondary gate stood chained and rarely used. The man remained low over the saddle, not pulling back, not urging forward, simply allowing the motion to carry him. "Shut that gate!" someone yelled from the side. Too late. The stallion didn't slow. He didn't hesitate. He gathered himself and surged through the narrow opening where the chain hung loose enough to give way under force. Wood struck wood, metal clanged. The gate burst open. The horse shot through. And instead of pulling him back toward safety, the man let him run, straight toward the dark stretch of land beyond the arena, toward a place no one had spoken about in years. Cold air struck harder beyond the arena lights, stripping away the warmth of spectacle and leaving only distance, shadow, and the sound of hooves breaking frozen ground. The stallion did not slow. Each stride carried him farther from the ordered world behind, into a stretch of land that had long ago slipped out of use and out of conversation. Behind them voices rose, scattered and sharp. "After them!" "What is he doing?" But the urgency carried confusion more than authority. No one had expected the horse to choose a direction. No one had expected the rider to let it. The man stayed low over the saddle, not gripping, not fighting. His body moved with the rhythm beneath him, steady as if he were not chasing control, but following something already decided. The wind pressed against his coat, tearing at the edges, but he did not look back. The horse knew where he was going. That much was clear now. They passed the last line of lanterns where light faded into gray. The ground changed underhoof, less groomed, more uneven. Frost clung thicker here, untouched by maintenance. The air smelled different too, sharper, tinged with old wood and something faintly metallic that had not fully left. The stallion veered slightly left, cutting across a narrow rise. A man from the crowd, older, slower, had followed as far as the broken gate. He stopped there, breath caught in his throat, eyes narrowing as he watched the path unfold. "No," he muttered, almost to himself, but he did not finish the thought, because he recognized it. The horse surged forward again, climbing a low incline where the earth rose just enough to hide what lay beyond. The man on his back lifted his head slightly now, eyes fixed ahead. He had not guided the turn. He had not asked for it. And yet, "I remember," he whispered, not to the horse, but to the place. The wind swallowed the words. Behind them more people had gathered at the edge, hesitant to cross into the unlit ground. Hale pushed through them, his coat no longer arranged with care, his voice cutting through the uncertainty. "Cut him off at the ridge!" But the order came too late, and to the wrong moment, because the horse was no longer running wildly. He was tracing something. Each turn came with a strange certainty, like steps laid down long ago and never entirely erased. The stallion's ears flicked forward, his breathing deep but measured now. There was no panic in him, no confusion, only direction. They crested the rise. On the other side, the land dipped into a shallow clearing, half hidden, half forgotten. The outline of old fencing leaned at broken angles. A structure stood near the far edge, its wood darkened with age, its doors shut tight and bound with a heavy chain that had not been touched in years. The stallion slowed, one step, then another. The man straightened in the saddle, his eyes fixed on the building ahead. The shape of it pulled something from him, not fear, not surprise, but a quiet, unavoidable recognition that settled deep in his chest. "I knew you'd come back here," he murmured. The horse let out a low breath. They moved forward together, closing the last stretch without haste. Behind them the crowd reached the ridge, but no one crossed it yet. They stood at the edge, looking down into the clearing as though it belonged to a different time, one they had agreed, silently, collectively, not to revisit. Hale arrived last. When he saw where the horse had stopped, something in his expression broke, not loudly, not visibly to everyone, but enough that those closest to him felt it. "That place is sealed," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. The stallion came to a full stop before the chain doors. For a moment nothing moved. Then the horse lowered his head and struck the ground once, a sharp crack against frozen earth. Again. The sound echoed up into the still air, reaching the crowd in a way no voice had managed. The man slid down from the saddle, boots landing softly in the frost. He did not rush forward. He stood there for a second, looking at the door, at the chain, at the silence that had wrapped itself around the place for years. "You never forgot," he said quietly. The horse shifted beside him, breath steady, waiting. From the ridge someone finally spoke, their voice barely carrying. "What is this place?" No one answered, because they knew they had always known. They had just chosen not to say it out loud. The man stepped closer to the door. The chain hung heavy, rusted at the edges but still intact, a deliberate barrier, not neglect. He reached out, fingers brushing against the cold metal. The touch sent a faint vibration through it, a sound so small it might have been imagined. Behind him, Hale's voice came again, tighter now. "Leave it." The man did not turn. "You closed it," he said, calm, almost distant. "Not him." A silence fell that felt heavier than anything before. The horse lifted his head slightly, eyes fixed on the door. Waiting. The chain gave a dull, reluctant sound when he pulled it free, metal against metal, stiff with years of being left alone. No one rushed forward to stop him. No one even told him to stop again. They were watching now, not as spectators, as witnesses. The man let the chain fall. It struck the wood once and hung loose, swaying slightly in the cold air. For a moment he did nothing else. His hand remained on the door, as if he could feel something through it, something that had waited longer than anyone outside had been willing to remember. Behind him the horse stepped closer, not pushing, not restless, present. The man drew a breath and pulled the door open. It resisted at first, the wood swollen and stiff from seasons of neglect, then gave with a slow groan that seemed louder than it should have been. The darkness inside wasn't complete. A narrow beam of fading light slipped in, catching dust in the air and revealing shapes that had not been moved in years. Old tools, a broken latch, a hook left hanging with nothing tied to it. The man stepped inside, boot against floor, a small echo, then stillness again. The crowd leaned forward without realizing it. Even those who had stayed at the ridge felt the shift, the kind that happens when a place long kept closed begins to speak again, not with words, but with what it holds. He moved slowly, scanning the room. Every step was careful, deliberate, as though he already knew where to look and only needed the courage to confirm it. The horse remained at the doorway, watching him. Hale stood outside the clearing now, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on the open door. The color had drained from his face, leaving something colder behind, something harder to disguise. "There's nothing in there," he said, but the words lacked force. The man did not respond. He crossed to the far corner, where a wooden chest sat half hidden beneath a layer of dust and time. One side of it was cracked. The lid didn't close properly anymore. He knelt. For a second his hand hovered over it, much like it had over the horse earlier that night, caught between hesitation and certainty. Then he lifted the lid. A soft breath escaped him. Not surprise, recognition. Inside were items too ordinary to be displayed, too personal to have been discarded without meaning. a worn halter, a length of braided rope, and beneath them something folded, tucked away as if it had been placed there quickly, without the intention of ever returning. He picked it up. Paper. A few people shifted where they stood. Someone whispered, "What is it?" The man unfolded it slowly, careful not to tear what time had already weakened. His eyes moved across the page once, then again, as though each word carried more weight now than it had when first written. Outside, the wind passed through the clearing, brushing against the open door, stirring the dust just enough to make the space feel alive again. Hale took a step forward. "Enough," he said, but it sounded more like a request than an order. The man rose, the paper still in his hand. He turned then, not toward the crowd, not toward the horse, but toward Hale. For the first time, the distance between them felt measured in something other than space. "You told them it was my fault," he said quietly. No one spoke. Not because they didn't hear, but because they did. Hale's jaw tightened. "You were there," he answered, the words coming faster now, defensive, practiced. "You were the one who tried to pull her away." The man interrupted. The interruption was not sharp. It was calm, certain, the kind that doesn't argue, it corrects. A ripple passed through the people behind Hale. Some faces shifted, expressions tightening, as if old memories were being forced into new shapes. The man stepped forward, holding the paper out, not dramatically, not accusingly, simply offering it to be seen. "She wrote this before she came out here," he said. Hale didn't take it, didn't even look at it. His gaze had moved past the man now to the horse standing just outside the doorway. The stallion's head was slightly lowered, eyes steady, as if he had already reached the part of the story the others were only now beginning to understand. "She knew he'd come back here," the man continued, "knew he'd take the same path." A few of the older men in the crowd shifted again. One of them rubbed his face slowly, eyes fixed on the ground, as if trying to place something he had buried too quickly. "The latch was broken before I got there," the man said. "The gate wasn't secured. He bolted, and she followed." Silence. Not empty. Heavy. The kind that settles when something long accepted begins to fracture. "I didn't push him," he added. "I didn't lose control." He lowered his hand slightly, the paper trembling just enough to catch the last of the light. "I tried to bring her back." Hale's hand tightened around the rail beside him. For a moment it looked as though he might speak again, might reshape the story, reassert the version that had held for years. But no words came, because too many eyes were on him now, and for the first time they weren't looking for confirmation. They were looking for truth. The horse shifted, stepping forward just enough that his shadow fell across the threshold of the old room. A quiet presence, unmoving, certain. The man turned his head slightly, his voice softer now, but somehow carrying farther than before. "He didn't forget," he said. The statement hung in the air, unanswered, unchallenged, and for the first time since the laughter had begun hours ago, no one tried to replace the silence. No one reached for the paper. It remained in the man's hand, its edges trembling faintly in the cold, as if even the wind hesitated to touch it now. The truth had already crossed the space between them. It no longer needed to be read aloud. The crowd stood still along the ridge, no longer a single voice, no longer certain of anything they had once repeated so easily. Faces that had laughed hours ago now carried something heavier, something slower to form, and harder to escape. Regret did not arrive loudly. It settled. Hale's shoulders lowered almost imperceptibly. The posture that had once held command now seemed uncertain, like a structure that had lost its foundation but had not yet collapsed. He looked at the man, then at the horse, and finally at the open doorway behind them, the place he had sealed, not to protect, but to avoid. "I gave them an answer," Hale said at last, his voice thinner than before. "They needed one." The man didn't step closer. "That doesn't make it true." The words landed without force, yet nothing in the clearing could push against them. Hale looked away toward the dark stretch of land where the horse had come from, as if hoping distance might return something he had already lost. "It was easier," he muttered. No one answered that either, because they understood. The man lowered the paper and folded it carefully, as though the act itself carried a kind of respect for the person who had written it, for the version of events that had been left behind. He didn't offer it again. Instead, he placed it back inside the chest, beneath the halter and the rope, returning it to the place where it had been hidden, not to bury it, but because it no longer needed to prove anything. Outside, the stallion shifted his weight and let out a slow breath. The sound carried softly across the clearing. The man stepped past him, resting a hand briefly against the horse's neck. There was no urgency in the touch, no attempt to hold him there, no claim of ownership, just acknowledgement. "You brought me back," he said under his breath. The horse's ear flicked once, catching the tone more than the words. Behind them, someone in the crowd took a step forward, then stopped. Another man removed his hat, holding it against his chest without realizing why. A woman turned her gaze away, blinking too quickly. No one apologized, not out loud. Some things could not be undone by sound. Hale remained where he was, his hand still resting against the rail, though he no longer leaned on it. For the first time he looked smaller, not in stature, but in certainty. The story he had told for years had held him upright. Without it, there was nothing left to support him but the truth he had refused to face. He did not try to stop the man as he walked past, did not call him back, did not offer anything in return, because there was nothing he could give that would match what had been taken. The man crossed the clearing slowly, the ground firm beneath his steps. He didn't look at the ridge, didn't search for faces, didn't wait for acknowledgement. The silence behind him followed, not as pressure, but as something earned. The stallion hesitated for a moment, then fell into step beside him. No rope, no rein, just presence. They moved together toward the open land beyond the broken gate, leaving the lantern glow and the watching eyes behind. The wind picked up again, threading through the clearing, brushing over the open doorway, the fallen chain, the marks in the ground where hooves had struck and stopped. At the ridge, the crowd remained. No one spoke, not because they didn't have words, but because none of them fit anymore. The man did not turn back. The horse lifted his head slightly as they reached the edge of the field, ears forward, as if listening for something ahead rather than behind. Then, without signal, they continued on. Two figures moving into the quiet, carrying with them nothing but what had already been decided. Long after they were gone, the clearing stayed as it was. Door open, chest uncovered, silence settled deep into the wood and earth. And for those who had been there, that silence did not fade. Sometimes the loudest truth doesn't come from words, but from what refuses to be forgotten. We're quick to judge, quicker to believe what's easy, and slow to question what might be wrong. But truth has a way of finding its way back. If this story stayed with you, there's more waiting. Stories where silence speaks louder than anything else.
If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts below and subscribe to Horse Heart Healing for more stories like this.